The air inside the Franklin Civic Auditorium pulsed with pride and celebration, a tapestry of families in their finest clothes filling the seats, fanning themselves against the early summer heat, their eyes and cameras fixed on the stage where young dreams stood moments away from blooming into reality. Banners of blue and gold hung from the ceiling, displaying the graduating year with bold flair, and below them, the school orchestra tuned their instruments while parents, grandparents, and siblings murmured with anticipation. In the middle section, near the front where the view was best and the names of the graduates would be heard loudest, sat Master Sergeant Naomi Brooks, her marine dress blues crisp, her medals catching every flicker of stage light, her face composed. In a way only a woman forged by over 2 decades of combat and command could manage. Her spine straight, her boots polished, her expression calm but alert. Not with suspicion, but with the quiet readiness of someone who'd been both a battlefield leader and a single mother, watching over a son she had raised through deployments, late-night homework sessions, scraped knees, and the unrelenting challenge of preparing a black child to thrive in a world that too often saw his worth as negotiable. Naomi had arrived nearly an hour early, knowing crowds could get unruly, and, wanting to ensure she got to her seat without drama, she was directed by a staff member to a row marked reserved for honored guests, and handed a simple but official-looking placard with her son Jordan's name on it, along with hers, printed below in military-style typeface, Emisgent Naomi Brooks, guest of valedictorian. She had smiled softly at the formality. Jordan had always insisted on honoring her titles, never letting her hide in anonymity. Today was about him, but he made it about them both. For a while all was well. Naomi sat with hands folded, occasionally, nodding at other parents who gave polite smiles, though some offered her longer glances, the kind that lingered with subtle questioning. What was a Marine in uniform doing here, and in a seat usually occupied by donors or district officials? Naomi ignored it, focusing on the program in her lap, tracing her son's name where it appeared first on the speaker list, his academic achievements listed beside the medals he'd won in debate, science fairs, and national ROTC competitions. The noise of the crowd began to rise as more families filtered in, and she hardly noticed when 2 uniformed security guards, both white males, one older with a shaved head, the other younger with a radio clipped tightly to his belt, approached from the side aisle and stopped in front of her, their postures neither respectful nor overtly aggressive, but laced with that officious tone too many people adopt when they believe their authority gives them license to diminish someone else's dignity. "Ma'am," the older one said, leaning down slightly, voice low but firm. "This section is for special families and district guests. You may need to move to general seating." Naomi blinked, calmly turning her head to meet his eyes, her voice smooth and controlled when she replied, "I am one. My son is the valedictorian, Jordan Brooks. This seat was assigned to me by the school." She held up the placard without tension, showing him the official designation. The younger guard looked down at it, but didn't seem to read it before muttering, "We've had issues before with people trying to get closer seats, especially with uniforms. This is for families with invitations." Naomi didn't blink, didn't shift. "Are you implying I'm impersonating a Marine or that I forged a school-issued invitation?" she asked, the question soft but razor-edged, the kind of tone only trained warriors mastered, and something in her calm unnerved them more than any raised voice ever could. The older guard cleared his throat, tried again. "I'm saying we need to verify. We'll ask you to relocate until that's done." At this point, several heads in nearby rows turned, some with curiosity, others with concern. Naomi could feel it but didn't let it show. Her hands stayed on her lap, her posture steady. "No, I'm not moving. I've earned this seat. My son asked me to be here, and unless you have a superior, with clearer authority or a lawful reason, to remove me, I suggest you double-check your list before embarrassing yourselves further." There was a slight pause as the younger one seemed to bristle, then stepped closer, gesturing at the placard and saying, "It's just a seat, ma'am. No need to make this difficult. We'll help you find a good one elsewhere." Naomi's eyes narrowed, not in anger but with a precision that had made her feared in briefing rooms across continents. "I've faced warlords, insurgents, and bureaucrats with more tact than this. I suggest you take a walk and confirm with the administration before escalating a problem you don't understand." By now, the tension was thick enough to be felt across rows. A few parents began murmuring, and a nearby student whispered to their mum, "Isn't she the one who served with special forces?" Another leaned over to say, "That's Jordan's mum. She's a Marine, like the real deal." But the guards weren't listening to the atmosphere. The older one sighed and muttered into his radio, stepping aside for a moment, while the younger one remained too close for Naomi's comfort. "We'll get this sorted, but again, please don't cause a scene." Naomi simply sat still, gaze unwavering. "You're the only ones causing one." The irony, of course, was that she had spent her career preventing conflict, diffusing violence, and holding the line when others broke. But now, at her son's graduation, dressed in the same uniform that had earned her commendations from 3 presidents, she was being treated like an intruder. Not because she was loud, not because she was defiant, but because she was a black woman in a space some assumed didn't belong to her. The quiet bias in the room had found a mouthpiece in these guards, and she knew how quickly things could spiral when prejudice wore a badge. Yet she also knew something the guards didn't. She wasn't alone. She hadn't arrived with anyone, but that didn't mean her people weren't here. Naomi had friends, brothers, teammates. Some of them were ghosts she carried in her memories from missions that had gone too dark, too long. Others were flesh and blood warriors, still living, still watching, some of whom she had tipped off weeks ago when Jordan's school released the graduation schedule. She'd mentioned the location, the date, the seat number, joking half seriously about how her son had insisted she wear full dress blues, not realizing that her presence would challenge the invisible lines people still tried to draw in public spaces. And somewhere in that crowd, those friends were waiting not as spectators but as guardians. Because if there was one truth Naomi Brooks lived by, it was this: Marines don't leave each other behind. And she had been there for them in places the world never heard about. The debt was deep, the loyalty deeper. And when the moment came, if the disrespect continued, those quiet shadows would step forward, and the world would learn that you don't try to remove a storm from a chair. It earned. You don't tell steel to yield. You don't tell a mother who bled for her son's future that she doesn't belong at the front of the room where he'll make his first speech as a graduate. And you damn sure don't test a Marine surrounded by warriors just waiting for a reason to stand. Naomi Brooks had been taught early, long before she wore the eagle, globe, and anchor on her uniform, that silence in the face of injustice was complicity, that dignity required spine, not just speech, and that no one, no matter how many stripes they wore on their sleeve or what color their skin was, had the right to diminish the humanity or honor of another. And so as the older security guard's hand hovered near her chair and the younger one stepped in close enough for his breath to mingle with hers, Naomi rose, not with the volatility the men may have expected, not with the frustration that would have given them an excuse to call for force, but with the calm authority of someone who had once stared down Taliban commanders under a white flag on a dirt road in Helmand province, who had once stood between a frightened village elder and a mortar strike, who had once, with blood in her boots and a cracked rib, carried a wounded corpsman across a mile of sniper alley without losing composure. She stood tall, unwavering, her chin high, eyes locked on the guard in front of her. And in that moment, it was not just a mother they were trying to push from a folding chair. It was the living embodiment of valor they were trying to shove back into a box that could no longer contain her. Slowly, deliberately, Naomi reached into the inner lining of her jacket and withdrew a leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming badge from the Department of Defense, her photo laminated beside her active credentials as a senior non-commissioned officer and a strategic liaison officer, positions that gave her not only the right to sit where she was, but the weight to have any of these men removed on federal grounds if she so chose. And yet, she didn't wave it in their faces. Instead, her voice sliced through the murmuring auditorium like a steel blade hidden in velvet. "I've served longer than you've been alive," she said, eyes locked on the younger guard, who was now clearly second-guessing every breath he took. "And I've bled for a flag that lets you wear that badge." I don't need to prove I belong, but you clearly do. A hush rippled across the rows near her, as murmurs turned to silence, phones lowered, and heads turned, not just in curiosity, but in awe. It was the kind of silence that precedes reverence, or reckoning. The guards weren't ready for either. Instead of backing down, the older one turned away and pressed a button on his shoulder radio, speaking low into the mic, summoning more security in what he assumed would reinforce his authority. But all he succeeded in doing was triggering a chain reaction Naomi had already foreseen. She didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice or even step forward. But 4 rows behind her, movement began, silent, coordinated, deliberate. One man stood first, tall and broad with cropped hair and a long scar over his right eyebrow, dressed in dark jeans and a blazer that did nothing to hide the presence of muscle, built not for vanity, but for survival. A second rose beside him, shorter but with eyes that flicked like radar, reading every corner of the room before he even moved. Then 3 more men stood in unison, each spaced throughout the auditorium in civilian clothes, unnoticed until now, their stillness broken only by the act of rising, their posture immediately giving them away to anyone who had ever served. They were warriors, Navy SEALs, forged in combat, disciplined by silence, deadly by design. These were not bodyguards. These were not protesters. These were brothers. Men who had fought beside Naomi in places no one in the auditorium could pronounce, on missions that would never see daylight or headlines. Men who had been dragged from rubble by her, pulled from rivers under gunfire by her, patched up, defended, protected, led, and who had never, not for a second, forgotten the debt they owed her. They had not come for drama. They had come for loyalty, for honor, for her son. Each had flown in quietly, using leave days, covert networks of travel, and quiet coordination not even Naomi knew in full. The only one who suspected their presence was Jordan, her son, who had written to one of them on Instagram weeks earlier, explaining how his mom never let him brag about her, never boasted, never talked about what she'd survived, or the medals she'd earned, and how she'd refused to accept the school's offer to make a speech because she didn't want to make the day about her. And so Jordan, knowing what she meant to those she served with, had reached out in secret, asking if some of them might come quietly, just to be in the crowd, just to see the woman he called the most silent lion in the pride honored for once by someone other than him. And now, as these 5 SEALs moved from their rows, closing ranks slowly and casually but with unmistakable presence, the guards sensed that something had shifted, not just in the room, but in the chain of authority they thought they controlled. Commander Wyatt Kane, the one with the scar and the weight of multiple combat tours, stepped forward first, his presence cutting through the aisle as if the air made way for him. "Is there a problem here, Sergeant Brooks?" he asked, deliberately addressing Naomi by her title, so everyone in earshot would register that she was not just some attendee in a fancy uniform, but a Marine recognized by warriors of the highest echelon. Naomi didn't respond right away. She didn't need to. The shift in energy was doing the work. The guards glanced from her to the 5 men now approaching, like sentinels reclaiming territory. One of them, a black man with a tattoo of a falcon barely visible under his rolled sleeve, moved beside Naomi and said quietly to the younger guard, "You're standing too close to a woman who's kept more men alive than you've seen die. In movies. Back up." The older guard tried to find his voice, stammering something about school jurisdiction and safety protocols, but Kane cut him off with a smile that held no warmth. "You're standing in the way of a Marine who was invited, vetted, and earned that seat with a currency you don't understand. Blood and sacrifice. You want to call more help? Do it. Call the school board. Call the city. Hell, call the Pentagon. I'll wait." The younger guard began to step back now, visibly sweating, realizing that what he'd seen as a simple confrontation had escalated beyond his training, beyond his comprehension. One of the SEALs pulled out his phone and, without raising his voice, said, "I've already notified Rear Admiral Thomas. He's aware of the situation. If she's touched again, we'll be escalating it on federal protocol. Your move." At that point, the auditorium had all but gone silent. The orchestra had stopped rehearsing. Faculty on stage had begun whispering behind podiums. Students near the front row whispered Naomi's name with a mix of confusion and wonder, and a young teacher who had served in the Navy quietly walked over to the principal and said, "You might want to pause the ceremony prep. We're in the presence of people who take chains of command seriously." Naomi remained standing, not to intimidate, but because she was done being told to sit down by people who had never stood for anything. Her silence was not submission. It was calculation. Because she knew now that the moment wasn't about her anymore. It was about every woman, every veteran, every black mother who had ever been questioned in a place where her child was supposed to be celebrated. And she would not let the moment be stolen. The guards, now clearly overwhelmed, murmured something about just following up on a report, then turned and walked away, radioing in a vague, situation-resolved code as they retreated toward the back. But the damage had been done, and the correction had been witnessed. Naomi turned to her brothers in arms and gave a subtle nod, a gesture of both gratitude and dismissal, and they understood immediately. Their presence had served its purpose. They returned to their seats silently, like wolves returning to cover, their eyes still scanning, always alert but no longer needing to protect. Naomi sat once more, her hands folded neatly, her program back in her lap. But now the seat felt different. It wasn't just a front-row chair for a graduation. It was a throne reclaimed, a symbol of defiance turned into dignity, a testament to the strength of silent power. The people around her who had earlier given suspicious glances now leaned in with quiet respect. One mother even whispered, "I'm so sorry they treated you like that. Thank you for your service." Naomi gave her a small smile. "Thank you." "For seeing me," she replied. And as the lights dimmed and the orchestra struck the first celebratory chord of the processional, she allowed herself the smallest breath of relief, not because she had been vindicated, but because she hadn't had to fight alone. Her son was about to walk across the stage as valedictorian. But long before his name was called, the room had already learned who the real leader in the building was, and she hadn't needed a speech or spotlight to prove it. Just presence. Patience and 5 shadows ready to rise the moment the world tried to make her invisible again. As the applause crashed through the auditorium, like a tidal wave breaking over walls too long held against respect, Naomi Brooks stood motionless at first, her mind struggling to reconcile years of invisibility and unacknowledged service with this moment of raw, unfiltered recognition, because while her instincts as a Marine had long taught her to stand straight, to remain composed, and to never seek the spotlight, the woman within, the mother who had sacrificed birthdays, first, steps, and soft lullabies to deploy to dusty war zones, where her name was only called over radios and dog tags, felt something deep and unspoken unravel inside her, something that could not be stitched with medals or stitched up with protocol, because this moment wasn't choreographed, wasn't charity, wasn't a gesture of politeness from some official who wanted a photo op. No, this was earned pure, and given not by bureaucracy, but by the voices of children who had never met her, parents who had once doubted her, teachers who had assumed she was just another guest in the sea of faces, and strangers who had seen courage, real courage, not the loud, performative kind, but the kind that walks quietly, sits patiently, and endures being underestimated until the truth breaks through like sunlight after a storm. And as the principal's voice faded and the standing ovation carried on longer than anyone expected, Naomi felt herself slowly rising, not because the room had demanded it, but because her son's eyes found hers across the crowd, locked in quiet pride and unspoken gratitude, and in that connection, she found her center, her compass, her why, and stood tall, not just in salute but in self, her body a silhouette against the auditorium lights, her uniform a stitched memory of deployments and desert winds, of folded flags and names etched on granite. And she raised her hand slowly, then salute not just to the crowd, but to every moment that had led to this one, to the brothers and sisters she had lost, to the children she had hugged in video calls from bunkers, to the countless times she had returned home only to be seen as a shadow, and across the rows, the 5 SEALs saluted in unison, an unbroken wall of honor and memory, their bodies facing hers like shields raised in eternal brotherhood. And when they lowered their hands, the silence was not empty but sacred, the breath held in reverence, as if the entire auditorium had caught its breath in respect of something that transcended protocol and politics. a reverence so palpable even the guards who had tried to remove her stood rooted, unsure whether to vanish or applaud. And as Naomi sat again, her hands trembling slightly with the intensity of emotion held too long, the program resumed, but everything was different now. The energy recalibrated, the audience leaning forward as if aware that they were no longer just watching another graduation, but a story that would be retold, passed down, etched into the school's walls and whispered during future ceremonies. Did you know? She was here, the Marine, the one who stood. And as the music played and names were called, Naomi's presence was not passive. No, it glowed in the space around her, in the eyes of every student who had ever felt overlooked, in the posture of every parent who now held their heads a little higher, and as Jordan's row stood, the moment drew near, the one Naomi had traveled, across the country for, the moment her son, the boy who had endured deployments and silence, who had grown up folding her uniform with care and watching her strength without ever needing words to understand it, would walk the stage. Not just as valedictorian, but as the son of the most powerful woman in the building. And as his name echoed over the loudspeakers, Jordan Alexander Brooks, the room erupted again, not just in polite applause, but in thunderous affirmation, because now they knew who he was, now they understood the soil from which he had risen. And as he crossed the stage, shaking hands with faculty who looked at him with renewed awe, he didn't beam or swagger. He walked with the same quiet strength his mother had modeled all his life, pausing only when he reached the far end of the stage to glance back, eyes scanning until they found her. And then, in a gesture more intimate and profound than any speech, he raised his fist to his chest and tapped it twice, a silent signal from son to mother, soldier to warrior, child to protector, and Naomi, in turn, touched her hand to her heart and nodded. And in that exchange, 1,000 stories were told, of deployments survived, of homework done alone, of tears cried into pillows and resilience forged in silence, and now, all of it honored, not in headlines or parades, but in the eyes of a crowd that had seen true valor and could never unsee it. And as the ceremony rolled forward, every announcement, every musical performance, every speech carried within it the echo of what had happened, of what they had witnessed, and when the final diploma had been handed out and the graduates through, their caps in the air, there was no confusion about who the heart of the ceremony had been. Not just Jordan, brilliant and humble as he was, but the woman who had stood her ground when dignity was questioned, who had drawn no weapon but truth, no allies but loyalty, and who had reshaped the narrative of that graduation without ever raising her voice. And as the crowd poured out into the courtyard, into sunlight and laughter and balloon bouquets, people sought her out, not for autographs or selfies, but for words, for connection, for the chance to say thank you in ways they had never had the courage or clarity to say before. And she shook hands, smiled, accepted embraces, posed with students who whispered, "You're a legend," and hugged mothers who had once looked at her with suspicion and now said things like, "I hope my daughter turns out like you." And Naomi received it all with grace, but never with ego, because she had never needed applause. What she needed was this: truth seen, service respected, her son recognized not just for his brilliance but for surviving and thriving with a mother who had chosen service both at home and abroad. And just when she thought the moment couldn't deepen further, a soft voice behind her said, "Master Sergeant Brooks," and she turned to see the principal himself, eyes glassy, hands clasped in front of him like a schoolboy, saying, "I owe you an apology. We should have introduced you from the beginning. I didn't know. I didn't take the time to ask." And Naomi, instead of chastising him, placed a hand on his shoulder and said gently, "Now you know, do better for the next one. That's how we grow." And with that she turned and walked to her son, who now stood at the base of the flagpole with his cap in one hand and diploma in the other. And when he saw her approach, he didn't speak. At first, just opened his arms, and they held each other for a long time. The kind of embrace that absorbs years of separation, that closes wounds left open by silence. And finally he whispered, "You were the ceremony, Mom," to which she replied with a chuckle, "No, I just made sure it had the right ending." And as the 5 SEALs joined them in the courtyard, forming a loose circle around Mother and son, people instinctively gave space, not out of fear but out of awe, as if they were witnessing something sacred, A reunion not just of warriors, but of truth, dignity, and bloodlines unbroken by time. And in that ring of loyalty, under the sky that now seemed impossibly clear, Naomi finally exhaled, not from exhaustion, but from peace, because for the first time in too long she had been seen, not just as a Marine or as a black woman or as a mother, but as all of them at once, indivisible, undeniable, unstoppable. As the final moments of the ceremony approached, a stillness settled over the crowd like the hush before a sunrise, not out of exhaustion or formality, but because something had shifted, irreversibly, profoundly. And as Jordan Brooks stood at the podium, cap slightly tilted, tassels swaying gently as if nodding in approval of all that had just unfolded, the gymnasium became more than a graduation hall. It became a cathedral of truth, redemption, and generational triumph. And when he took a deep breath, cleared his throat, and raised his eyes to the packed bleachers, it was not the voice of a nervous teenager that filled the room, but that of a man forged in the quiet strength of his mother's example, his words rippling out like waves across an ocean of stunned admiration. "Before I talk about honor cords, GPAs, or scholarships," he began, his voice calm but unwavering, "you need to understand the definition of true success, because I learned it from someone who never once stood on a stage like this, but who deserves every spotlight we've got." And with that, he turned his body slightly and extended one hand toward the bleacher, where Naomi Brooks now sat flanked by her SEAL brothers in arms, her once quiet presence now immortalized by the respect etched into every face in the audience. And Jordan continued, "I introduce you to Master Sergeant Naomi Brooks, Marine, mother, hero, my foundation." And the crowd, students, parents, teachers, janitors, and even the once dismissive guards, rose in unison, not out of obligation or guilt, but because they could no longer sit in the presence of someone whose very life had rewritten the definition of dignity. And as thunderous applause roared through the rafters, Naomi sat still for a beat, her training keeping her composed even as her soul cracked open with emotion. But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw something that unmoored even the warrior in her, one of the SEALs. Griff, the quiet one who had lost his leg in a firefight Naomi had pulled him from, reaching across and gently squeezing her hand, his scarred knuckles trembling slightly as he whispered, "You've earned this tenfold, ma'am. Let them see it." And with that she stood, not for herself but to acknowledge the power of what her son had done, how he had turned the narrative of the evening into something generational, transcendent, and lasting. And as she stood, the applause didn't fade. It surged like a second wave, deeper and more reverent, as if everyone in the room suddenly realized they weren't just celebrating a graduation, but witnessing history being carved in real time into the conscience of the community. And Jordan, overwhelmed but composed, began recounting the nights. His mother returned from deployment, slipping quietly into his room with eyes too tired to cry, but full of a love deeper than any lullaby. How she taught him discipline not with threats, but by example. How she missed birthdays because she was defending the very freedoms that allowed the rest of them to celebrate theirs. And how, despite everything, she still showed up to every parent-teacher conference in full uniform, drawing stares from other parents who didn't know whether to be impressed or uncomfortable. And he said, "I watched a woman carry nations on her back and still remember to iron my school shirts before her flights." And the crowd laughed through tears because it was real, raw, and without pretense. And then he said something that would echo for years. "Success isn't just crossing a stage. It's watching your mother be almost escorted out of a ceremony she earned the right to headline and seeing the entire room rise for her instead." And the crowd, unable to hold it back, clapped again, louder, longer, and Naomi, who rarely allowed herself tears, felt one slip down her cheek, not from sadness but from the kind of pride no medal had ever given her, the kind that came only when your child truly saw you. And Jordan closed by saying, "Mum, everything I am is because you refused to let the world tell me what I wasn't. You didn't raise a black boy to survive. You raised a man to lead. This diploma is as much yours as mine." And as he left the stage, the principal tried to resume the program, but the audience wouldn't settle. They chanted her name. "Brooks! Brooks! Brooks!" as if demanding that this moment not be diluted, not be tucked away under protocol and printed schedules, And finally, at the urging of the principal and the chants of students, Naomi was gently guided down from the bleachers, her boots echoing on the hardwood floor as she approached the stage, not for recognition she sought, but for legacy she had built. And when she reached the steps, Jordan met her there, offering his arm not as a child needing guidance, but as a son honoring a queen. And together they stood center stage, mother and son, framed by lights, balloons, and banners, but also by justice, truth, and resilience. And when the 5 seals lined up behind them in a quiet wall of solidarity, the visual was seared into every heart present, not a display of force but of unity, a family forged not just by blood, but by fire, duty, and unspeakable sacrifice. And afterward, in the courtyard, the celebration became less about graduation and more about connection, as dozens of students approached Naomi not to flatter her, but to say things like, "My mom served too, but no one's ever talked about it," or "You make me want to serve one day," or "I didn't think people like us got respect like this." And she responded to everyone with sincerity, taking time, shaking hands, even comforting a young girl whose father had died in service, offering a whispered Marine's prayer that left the girl's mother in tears. And the principal, once stiff and apologetic, approached Naomi with a proposal. "We'd like to name our annual leadership award after you, and we'd like to invite you to speak next year." And she smiled and replied, "I'll speak, but only if the award goes to the students who lead without needing a spotlight, because that's how real service starts." And as evening fell and families began to drift toward parking lots and after-parties, Naomi lingered near the flagpole with Jordan, watching the sunset in rich golds and purples, and he said, "You think Dad would have been proud?" And she replied, "He'd be mad I got more claps than him." And they both laughed, the weight of years lifting in that shared joke. And she added, "But yes, he'd be proud. You honored both of us today." And in that moment, they didn't need decorations or speeches, because they had reclaimed something deeper, dignity, not just for themselves, but for every quiet warrior who had ever been dismissed or unseen. And as the 5 seals stood nearby, watching the flag sway gently in the breeze, Griff said aloud what no one else had dared. "You know this will be on the news by morning, right?" And Naomi chuckled and said, "Let them tell it. Just make sure they get the part right where my son gave me back everything the world tried to strip away." And Griff nodded, knowing exactly what she meant, because warriors rarely get moments like this, unfiltered by pain or survival. And as night descended and the parking lot lights flickered on, the crowd gone and silence returned, Jordan and Naomi sat on the edge of the empty bleachers, mother and son, hero and heir, neither needing to speak because everything had already been said. And somewhere inside Naomi's chest, where years of duty had built walls and rituals, something finally settled. Not like surrender, but like peace, because she knew now, without a doubt, that legacy isn't about titles or medals or salutes. It's about what you leave behind in the hearts of those who watched you live. And that night, under a summer sky too vast for words, Naomi Brooks, Marine, mother, and the most honored person in the gym, closed her eyes not in exhaustion, but in wholeness, because she had not only served her country, but had lived to see her country, at last, stand for her.